Today we're going to be looking at the DC Collectibles Batman the Animated Series. This is figure 32, the Ventriloquist, and Scarface. Before we have a look at everything that comes with these two figures, I say two figures even though Scarface is more an accessory than anything else, let's figure out how tall they are. Ventriloquist on his own is about 5.5 inches. Or Scarface unfortunately does not stand at all, but the figure is roughly 2.5 inches in height. Yes, unfortunately, due to the looseness of Scarface's legs, he just does not have the proper means to stand, which is excusable really for the nature of what the character is. I mean, he is a dummy after all. I guess I could get him technically to stand. He has to just slightly lean a little bit forward. Before we have a look at his accessories, or their accessories, quickly just looking at the advertisement pamphlet that came included with it, it doesn't look like we're getting much in the way of new figures coming, at least not for the next little while. I think I've reviewed, yes I have reviewed basically everything on here except for the Batman and Robin Bat Signal. But if you guys wanted to check out all those reviews, I've got a playlist. Specifically, you could look up the DC Collectibles Batman the Animated Series playlist. You should be able to find everything that's in there. One of the things I do want to mention, and I'm bringing out the instructions here, which give very little indication of mention of Ventriloquist other than this section here, is I want to talk about the way that Scarface attaches himself to Ventriloquist. I suppose before we do that, we could look at the display stand that comes included with him. That comes with a front, side, and 3/4 back turn on Ventriloquist only. Scarface is not listed anywhere on the actual stand. The stand does have the adjustable neck, but it's one of the older formats of adjustable necks that have these sliding back and forth on it. I really think that they could have done something. They need to do something differently with these stands. I'm not crazy about these stands whatsoever. I thought of the idea, and I don't know how well it would work with every single figure, but something similar to what we got with Sideshow collectible pieces, is instead of actually having a clamp, what if they had something just like a little hook? Clear stand up and a little hook. And you would, theoretically, let's say we'll bring this down here. This is just way too loose. But imagining, if you will, this part here is the hook. You would essentially put the figure in between the hook. You'd still be able to get the figure to stand. You wouldn't get him in any dynamic poses, but really, to be fair, that clamp on the waist clip, this part here, really wouldn't hold the figure well enough anyways. But if they just simply had a clear neck and a little rod or a little curved section that stuck out from it, you easily just put the figure on top of it, and you could remove the figure anytime you wanted to. And maybe that would be something that they could entertain for future figures. I'm going to move that to the side. Ventriloquist also comes with, or more so for Scarface, comes with his Tommy gun. No paint, instead favoring a sculpt on the gray plastic to get the coloring across. And it fits into his hand. Then he also comes with a series of interchangeable hands, not Scarface necessarily, but more so the dummy, as it were. Comes with a relaxed hand. Actually, it comes with two of them. I just replaced the hand out there. It comes with a grip in hand, but he really doesn't have anything to hold other than if you wanted to give him the machine gun, as he's dispensed in many occasions his frustrations for the Scarface dummy. And he also has a closed fist. The hands are very small, but it's until you plug them into the socket that they seem like they are the correct size. Now, speaking of hands, I want to go back and I want to talk about Scarface here. I guess we'll spend some time talking about him, and then we'll talk about how he attaches to the ventriloquist hand. Paint on him doesn't really have a whole lot of paint, in all honesty. It looks like, for example, maybe the sleeves have been painted black, shoes, of course, painted black. Otherwise, he has what looks to be molded plastic, probably blue plastic arms. Of course, the hands are removable and detachable, although he doesn't come with any extra hands. Very, very loose legs. But for the nature of what he is, he doesn't need to be standing, really. So having loose legs isn't a deal breaker for me. His head does rotate, and then he has the gimmick where his head hinges up and down by the way that the peg here on the back is moved up and down. So if you have it into Ventriloquist's hand, once it's plugged into place, you can move the head up and down as if he's talking. His mouth doesn't open and close. You can't move that part of him, but his head at least does rotate. And not a bad looking representation of Scarface here. The back, however, is really where I have big problems with the figure. This whole torso here is soft rubber, and I get what they were trying to go with. They were trying to make the peg a concealed area, much like in the show. Ventriloquist would put his hand inside the back of dummy. He wouldn't have necessarily a big peg sticking out from him. So they've tried to mirror that, but ultimately it just doesn't work all that well. The reason why I wanted to bring in the instructions here, if you look at the back of the instructions, or the instructions, I suppose, the dummy, Ventriloquist's dummy, Scarface, looks like he has a longer peg on the back of him, and he doesn't. I looked in the packaging, I just wanted to double check that I didn't miss anything, but he doesn't have this long rod that attaches into his hand. Instead, what they gave him was this very small, let me just see if I can move the rubber out of the way, this very, very small peg. It barely, and I can't stress this enough, it barely fits into his hand. And ultimately what ends up happening, as you've probably already seen here, the rubber is starting to get wear marks where I'm pushing it against the sleeve. Let me show you what I'm doing here. So when I take the hand out, now you could use either hand really, you then have to take this little small peg right there, and you have to wedge it, see if I can show you here, wedge it into the socket of his wrist. And it's not easy, let me tell you. You have to do a little bit, you have to put a lot of pressure into getting that to attach to his hand. And ultimately it's successful, but it's at the cost of what it's doing. Look at you can see how it's being forced against the rubber, the softer material that's used on his jacket. Like I said, it does stay in place, but the downside though is why they could not have made the peg longer. I mean, it's not even close to being the length of the peg that's on the back of the instructions. It's much shorter, and I get it that they wanted to have it. Let me just pick up Scarface here. That they wanted to have it as close to his hand as possible, but at the very least, they could have made the peg a lot longer than this. And you can see the damage that I'm causing to the back of Scarface's torso here. So again, you can wedge it onto his hand, and then Scarface has the Tommy gun you can put into his hand. I mean, it's awkward to fit it into his hand, but at least you can get it in there, and it doesn't keep falling out, whereas Scarface keeps falling out of the Ventriloquist's hand socket. Let's see if I can get the Tommy gun in here. Problem is the handle of the Tommy gun is so big. As you can see, it wants to push itself off of his hand. And again, just trying to get it onto Ventriloquist's sleeve. Again, it gets it on there, but it doesn't stay well enough. It should have been a much longer peg than what we ultimately got here. After all that, I'm just only going to simply take Scarface off. And let's have a look at the Ventriloquist on his own. Very strange to see Ventriloquist on his own, but let's have a look at him. He's a good representation, I think, of how he looks in the cartoon. I don't feel like his face is 100%, but it's not bad, really. You can't see his eyes, but that's how he looks in the series. And let me just see if I can show you. I don't want to take the glasses off, but there are pupils, very dark black pupils, behind the eyes. Well, behind the glasses, at least. The paint on him has been kept very minimal, relying on solely a gray jacket, gray pants. But his paint is really clean. I don't think I've really had any problems with any of the DC Collectible Batman animated series for being poor in paint. Both the sculpt and paint have always been really good. If anything, it's the execution of sometimes loose legs. Ventriloquist luckily does not have that problem. He's nice and stiff in the leg. Longevity of that, I don't really know, but so far, so good. His jacket, I thought, was actually going to be softer, but it's as dense the plastic as it is on his arms. And again, face sculpt is really nicely done. The little curls of hair and little little peaks of hair that he's got sticking out on the back there. Again, really clean on the paint. Posability on this guy, his head rotates all the way around. Arms hinge outward. He's got very noticeable hinges where the elbows are, but I know there's really not a lot that could be done for that. He also can rotate at the forearm there, and he can also rotate the hand and hinge there, back and forth. A little bit of a waist swivel, forward and back on the legs, but not really much. You can split the legs out, bend at the knee, and you can also move the feet. Not a bad looking figure, I have to admit, and I'm really happy to get a Ventriloquist. The biggest problem, though, is the one thing you would want the figure to do well, and that's hold Scarface. Ultimately he does, but it's awfully a struggle to get that to accomplish itself, other than, and also getting the stand. Let's see if we can get him, get the dummy on his hand. There we go. Yeah, not a bad looking figure, but boy, is it a nightmare to get him to properly hold Scarface here. It's kind of sad. It's a little bit sad when a toy company releases a figure based on a character that you've always wanted to see in plastic form. Ventriloquist has not gotten a whole ton of figures in his time of being a character, but the ones that do get released are always ones I want to try to pick up and add to my collection. One of my favorites still is the Batman Ventriloquist and Dummy, which I thought worked the best so far for what we've gotten in this character. But this was the figure. This one right here from the animated series was the one I wanted to work the most. It's one of my favorite incarnations of the character, and it's a bit disappointing what we ultimately got here from DC Collectibles. Sure, the sculpt is good, both on Ventriloquist and the dummy Scarface, but the execution of, basically how everything comes together is the more disappointing aspect of it. From Scarface's standpoint, he has a real difficulty of holding the Tommy gun properly. If you angle it up like we're doing in final looks here, he does manage to hold it in his hand, but his hand just doesn't have the proper grip to hold it as properly as he should. But the biggest problem is Ventriloquist with the way he holds the dummy in the back of his sleeve. That peg should have been way longer than what we ultimately got here, and at the very least, I get the fact that they wanted to make it look seamless when you took Scarface off, but they should have just swapped the split out for instead a very obvious hole and made the peg a lot longer so it could fit into his hand. I really don't like the idea of having to force it onto his sleeve every single time. That I will entertain the idea of maybe gluing Scarface in place. Scarface is never really going to stand on his own in my collection, and I hate to even say it, but I think glue probably will be my best bet, just so I know that, well, he's going to indefinitely hold him, and he's not going to fall out of his hand. And then speaking of holding and speaking of in hand, well, in hand, this guy also has a big difficulty of standing on his own. I guess that, well, it probably wasn't the greatest of segues, but the stand does very little to hold this guy upright. And unfortunately, with Scarface being on the end of his hand, it does also mean that Ventriloquist here does topple over from time to time. And as soon as this guy topples over, Scarface falls off his hand, and you have to rinse and repeat until you get this guy to stand again. So Ventriloquist, good looking figure, not as good with the way that he was put together, and they really should have thought things out better. Even like looking at the instruction manual, I wonder if long peg was what they originally intended to do with the figure, and then ultimately just shorten the peg for his initial release. I think they should have probably gone back to the drawing board and stuck with the longer peg myself. Today, nonetheless, though, we were having a look at the DC Collectibles Batman the Animated Series. This was figure 32, and this was Ventriloquist, along with his dummy, Scarface. If you guys, again, wanted to go back and have a look at some of my other DC Collectibles Batman Animated Series figure reviews, don't worry, there's a playlist on this channel that you can check out and watch at your viewing pleasure. If you guys haven't also had a chance to hit that little subscribe button down below, make sure you do so. More videos will be coming your way. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.